Record. All right, so I have started recording, and today our topic is how can the Bible be read in chronological order? Where do I start? And this was again a question that somebody from our congregation had as I asked, what kind of Bible basics would people be interested in learning about that would help them in their study of the scriptures? So this is our topic for today. And a few moments ago with the, next slide, please. Where do I start? Where do I go on to? Let's see. Hold on. My slide stopped working. So let me just see what the problem is. My apologies for the delay. Why aren't you going somewhere? Next, here we go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I had participants start with this exercise, taking all of these different events and people, put them in order in which they happened historically. So our participants have done that already. For anybody who might be watching this as it was recorded, you're welcome to pause the video at this point to see if you can put these events and these people in the historical order in which they occurred. And then you're welcome to correct that as I go through the rest of the study. But we're going to move on. So in finding out first of all, the Bible is mostly in chronological order. There are just a couple things that might be a little bit out of place. So some of the places that we look that some of the resources for finding out when things happened are a lot of study Bibles have summaries at the beginning of each of the books of the Bible. Our Lutheran Study Bible has a summary at the beginning of each that tells you a little bit about the book of the Bible. And in that it gives you an idea of when the book was dated. Another resource in the Lutheran Study Bible, which is this Bible that I have here. We have a bunch of them at the church. Some of you were talking about possibly getting one. It's a good resource. You can get soft copy or softback or hardback. But in this, there is a Bible history timeline at the beginning on pages 30 to 32. And it's this glossy page, and it tells the Bible key events, the Bible key people, and then the powers and kingdoms that were in power at the time. So it's a really good timeline. I suggest that. That's really helpful. And of course, I mentioned this the last time. There's a website called enterthebible.org, and it is maintained by Luther Seminary, which is our biggest of our ELCA seminaries in the country. And that has a lot of information about how to read the Bible and about each of the books of the Bible. So that's a great place as well to find out when exactly the books of the Bible are, what time frame where they are at. There's often a difference, though, between the time frame covered in the book and the dating for when it was written. Sometimes the story is set in a specific time period, but the book itself wasn't written down until many years later. One of the examples of that is in the New Testament. Many of Paul's letters were actually written before some of the Gospels, but particularly the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John was one of the last of the Gospels written. And yet, of course, we know in the history, Paul definitely came after Jesus. In fact, Paul never actually met the person who walked on earth, Jesus, although Jesus appeared to him on the road to Emmaus. So there's this, in other words, that Paul's letters were written. There were stories about Jesus going around, but they didn't actually get written into the gospel forms, some of them, until after Paul's letters were written. And so sometimes that gets a little bit confusing. So I'm going to try to keep us as try not to confuse us too much. And so what we're going to focus on is the time frame that is covered in the Bible. In other words, how do we read the story of the Bible in chronological order as the story unfolds? And as I said, the story, I think, is probably what we're most interested in understanding, rather than knowing exactly when the book itself was written. So that's where my dating is. That's where I focused the dates that I'm basing this chronology on. And it's important to realize too that sometimes the dating system is not always the same between different denominations. So there are Bible timelines that are out there that you can buy, but they may or may not match up with the Bible history timeline that we have in our Lutheran study Bibles. So just be aware of that. Okay, now we're working. So if we look at the overarching story of the Bible, it can be broken down into these basic categories. We have the prehistory, and then the patriarchs and matriarchs of the faith, and then Moses, the Exodus, the wilderness journey, entering the promised land and period of the judges, the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, the exile and post-exile, along with the return, the life and ministry of Jesus, and the early church. Of course, the New Testament begins with the life and ministry of Jesus, so everything before that is found in the Old Testament. So I'm going to, of course, break these down so you understand what events are contained within each of these categories. But these are some basic categories to help us to break down what happened when. This is pretty much the historical order of things happening. And this helps us to realize that this is, in the Old Testament, it's the story of God establishing some relationship with humanity when, God is God and humanity is humanity. So how does God connect in some way with human beings? And so the story begins with Abraham and God's relationship with Abraham and Sarah being the first of the patriarchs and matriarchs of the faith. And then it goes through all of these different eras. So that's what I'm using to help break down the time periods. And I have a little asterisk there next to return. There's the exile. And then after the exile happens, the exile meaning many of God's people of Israel, or Judah, God's people were exiled into a foreign land, and that eventually they're able to return back to the land that they had originally been in. And I have a little asterisk there that says intertestamental period. There's after God's people return, there are a couple different empires that rule during that time, between that time and the time of the life and ministry of Jesus. We don't have in our canon any books of the Bible that cover anything other than the rule of Babylon, Persia, and then there's a little bit on the time when the Greeks were in power. But there isn't too much. But any time between what we have in the Old Testament and what we have in the life and ministry of Jesus can be referred to as intertestamental period. There might be some things that aren't actually in our canon from that time. All right. So starting with the prehistory and the patriarchs, matriarchs, I combined those two on the slide because they're both found in Genesis. So the prehistory means creation, the fall, the flood. These are events that can't really be dated, which is why it's called prehistory. Remember that dating something, putting a date to it, happened way after the events actually happened. So these are just some events that don't really have solid dates that can be associated with them. There might be some Christian traditions that say they can actually put a date to those events. As I said, there are some discrepancies sometimes between the different Christian traditions and the way we understand the background of the Bible. So that's called prehistory. Then Abraham and Sarah, through Jacob's sons, who become the families, whose families become the tribes of Israel. That's the time of the patriarchs and matriarchs. And the Jacob's sons, the one most famous is Joseph. Joseph's story ends at the end of Genesis. So that's the first part of Israel's story. The next part is Moses, the Exodus, and the wilderness journey. And this part of the story can be found in 4 other books of the Bible. The first being Exodus. Exodus contains the story about Jacob's descendants who become enslaved in Egypt. And then the calling of Moses to help free them. Moses leads them into the wilderness. They wander in the wilderness. And during that time, God gives God's people the Jewish law to help guide them, as God to tell them, you are now my people, and here are some ways that as my people you will live, so that you can be a witness to the nations of who I am, who God is. Then Leviticus contains some more specific parts of the Jewish law. Numbers contains some other stories of life in the wilderness, along with the census. We talked about how difficult numbers might be to get through if you're trying to read through the Bible in order. And then Deuteronomy contains some sermons by Moses and a review of God's covenant and the law. By the end of Deuteronomy, God's people have been wandering in the wilderness and they are ready to enter the promised land. Of course, Moses never enters the promised land. He dies before they can do that. So that's the next part of the story in order. Then we get to the part of the story where God's people enter the promised land. And then after that, the period of the judges. So the next leader of the people of God after Moses is Joshua. And he has a book named after him, the book of Joshua. And Joshua leads God's people into the promised land. Then the next book of the Bible is Judges. There's a period after God's people enter the promised land and after Joshua has died that God's people have trouble following God's laws, and they do some things turning away from God, and they get into some trouble. And so God has to call what was called judges. They were the leaders of God's people at that time, and they would come and they would lead God's people against any enemies that have come against them, so that they can be freed again. And then things would go well for a little while, and then God's people would start to forget God's ways and start doing bad things, and then enemies would come against them. And so Judges is the period of time when certain judges are raised up to lead God's people in the promised land. After Judges is the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is a story of a Moabite woman named Ruth and how she becomes part of King David's ancestral line. So it is most likely this point is probably a good place for Ruth to appear after the book of Judges, because God's people are living among other foreign peoples. So the book of Ruth would be put after Judges. The next era then is the United Kingdom. So after God's people kind of live somewhat haphazardly in the promised land for a little while, God's people start to pray. Well, they're given a prophet. This prophet is named Samuel, but prophets are people who speak God's word to God's people. And then once they have leaders like kings, the prophet gets to be the one to speak God's word to the king when the king starts to do things that they shouldn't do, or just to guide the king in leading God's people and caring for God's people in the ways that God would want. So the next books of the Bible are 1st and 2nd Samuel. They include stories about the prophet Samuel, along with Israel's first 3 kings, which is what they ask for. They want to be like the other nations, so they pray to God for a king. And that was never God's intention. God always wanted to be Israel's leader, Israel's king. But God gave them what they wanted. And so Israel had 3 kings over a united group of people. The first was Saul, the second was David, and the third one was Solomon. David's probably the one you're most familiar with. So the stories of these kings are in 1st and 2nd Samuel and in 1st Chronicles. 1st Chronicles, the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, by the way, it was explained to me as these are cleaned up stories of the king. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles kind of tells the story about these kings in a little bit better light, particularly King David. So, but if you were reading this in chronological order, 1st and 2nd Samuel and then 1st Chronicles all covers that time when the kings, when these 3 kings ruled over all of God's people together. Then there was, after the United Kingdom, there was a point in which there was some discrepancy over who should be king next. And that's when a divided kingdom came about. And because there was somebody who was in the line of David, King David, and Solomon, and then there was somebody who wasn't, and they divided the people's loyalties to the point where the kingdom was divided. So God's people were no longer God's people of Israel. Then they became God's people Israel and God's people Judah. So there were 2 peoples considered God's people, and that's the time of the divided kingdom. During that time, the prophets were Elijah and Elisha, along with prophets who have books named for them. So here I have a chronological listing, and this chronological listing is based off of datings that I found on enterthebible.org. You can check these with the summaries at the beginnings of each of the books of the Bible if you have a study Bible to see how they match up. But the first, number 1, I put down 1st and 2nd Kings. So 1st and 2nd Kings is about the other kings that came once the kingdom was divided. 2nd Chronicles is a kind of a repeat of stories about those kings of Israel and Judah. And then you might hear in those stories references to different prophets, but they may also not be named in the story themselves. Elijah and Elisha are definitely named in those books. So then here are other prophets who lived during the time of the divided kingdom, who were speaking God's word into the chaos that was happening at that time. So these are not ordered in the order that they appear in the Bible. So they're a little bit, so this would be an order to follow if you want to try to keep the story together. Micah, and some of these are around the same time, so I couldn't necessarily put them in order because they're contemporaries together. So you have Micah, and it's side by side, Micah, and then Amos, and then Hosea, and then Zephaniah, and then Nahum, Jonah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and Obadiah. So those would be the orders for the prophets of during the divided kingdom time. It looks like I put some on here that probably should go on the next page and in the next era, because after the divided kingdom, after the struggles of the divided kingdom, we get to the point where God's people are taken over by foreign powers. So this is part of the story that you guys might have had a little bit of trouble dating, that because we don't go over this as very much. So after there's some struggles, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah have some struggles with their foreign neighbors around them. They have some issues that they end up getting, like I said, into conflicts, and they end up getting overrun by other nations and other powers. So in 586, you have the Babylonians coming in, and they take over. Basically, they take over Judah. They destroy the temple, and Jerusalem falls. And then they send some of the upper society people into exile. That happens. So that's the first of the overrunning of God's people, where they are no longer their own kingdoms. They are ruled, occupied by foreign nations. So it goes Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks. And then during the time of the Greeks, these two other situations happen. With these two other groups, the Seleucids and the Hasmoneans. Both of those happened during the time of the Greek occupation. And then that takes you to the end of the Old Testament. And then the Romans start to rule towards the turn of what we consider the turn of the, what do you call that? The turn of the time from what we consider BCE to CE. And that takes us into New Testament times and the time of Jesus. So those are that's the order in which other countries ruled the area and the people considered God's people. And so during that time, then there were prophets that spoke into those situations. And so it helps you to know what situation the prophet is speaking to when you're reading them. So if you read these in this general order, you'll get a sense of what's going on. And this is somewhat chronological. Now, the book of Isaiah is a very long book. It spans both the time before the exile and during and as it was ending. So different parts of the book of Isaiah are addressing different moments in the life of God's people. It addresses the situation and that is happening as they are struggling with their with neighboring nations, the bad decisions they are making as God's people, turning away from God. Then what's happening when they get exiled and Jerusalem gets destroyed, and then what's happening as the possibility that they can return comes about. And so that expands from the Babylonian to the Persian time periods. Then Ezekiel would be about next, then Haggai, then Zechariah, and Zechariah would get us into then the Persian Empire. Ezra and Nehemiah are both dated around the first quarter of the 4th century during the Persian Empire. And then we have Joel, Malachi, and Esther, who I think were also during the Persian Empire. And then the book of Daniel is dated to be during the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which would have been during the Greek, I believe it was the Greek Empire. So those are the books that would go next in the story. So then after that, like I said, there are some other stories that can be found in the books known as the Apocrypha that cover the time between those prophets that I just talked about and the life and ministry of Jesus, the time called the intertestamental time. We just don't have many stories from that time in our canon, in the books that we use regularly. So now then we would go to the life and ministry of Jesus. And the life and ministry of Jesus is contained in 4 books of the Bible, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are not in any chronological order themselves. They are just, they all have the same story, that Jesus' life in some way, the beginning of the story, the middle of the story, the end of the story. But they just tell it differently. So you can read these in any order, although probably John, knowing that John was written last of the Gospels, you might want to read Matthew, Mark, and Luke first because they are similar to each other, and then read John, which is the way it's presented in the Bible anyway. And then the rest of the Bible, which is an awful lot of books of the Bible, I didn't put in any chronological order. Of course, the story of Acts would come after you read the Gospels, because those are the stories about how Jesus' apostles carried on his ministry after he ascended into heaven. and about the conversion and ministry of the new apostle Paul. And then the second half of Acts talks mostly about Paul's missionary work. First half talks a lot about Peter's work and some of the other apostles, but the second half talks more about Paul's work. And then the rest of the New Testament, the letters were written to new Christian communities throughout Asia Minor and Europe, but there's dating that is associated with when the letters were written, but as to it doesn't seem to really matter what order you read them in, because it's not telling a story necessarily. These are just letters that are sent that are addressing particular issues in particular Christian communities. So the chronology of the reading of those books of the Bible, which is a lot of them, from First Corinthians, from Romans to Revelation, you could read them in any order, pretty much. Although, if you're getting to the books like where there's First and Second Corinthians, read First Corinthians and then read Second Corinthians. First, Second, and Third John, read First, then Second, then Third John. You could certainly do that, but it's not quite the unveiling of a historical historical events that you find in the Old Testament. So the timing of reading those isn't going to be as important in understanding them. What will be more important in understanding those letters is to know the background. Who are they being written to, and what is the issue that's being addressed for them? So, and Revelation, a lot of people say that is about the end of time, so that's the last book. It is and it isn't. Revelation can be about now if the world happens to be in a lot of turmoil and struggle. It's very helpful for people who are facing a lot of hardship. It's supposed to be a book of hope that reminds us that God will win out in the end, that the powers of good are still at work to destroy the powers of evil. And so it's supposed to be a book of hope for any person at any time who's going through, the situation is really challenging, and they're kind of wondering, they're kind of in despair and wondering, where is God? So it doesn't have to be considered the last book, but the way the end of Revelation is written, it does kind of sound like, and in the end, God wins, which is true. But that book can be used at any time for any struggling community of faith. So with that, there are a couple books that didn't get mentioned: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Again, although there's probably dates associated with when these are written, they don't necessarily fit into the story, or they're not part of a story that is being told. They're books that you can read, and they don't have to be associated with any specific chronological time. So you can read those whenever. And that's the end of the slideshow. So I am going to shut off the recording. You hear this phone in the background. I canceled the sound on one phone and forgot to cancel the sound on the other one. So let me just, and thanks to everybody who watched.